Today we are going to be discussing Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. These are very important figures for us to grapple with, especially in the moment that we are in with the Black Lives Matter protests. I want to ask the question, how should we live out our responsibility for racial justice in terms of the writings and witness of these men? Malcolm X was born in 1925 and he was assassinated in 1965. He was born into a Garveyite family. That is, his father in particular was a devoted disciple of Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association that taught a black nationalism, a sense of black pride. So even though it would be later that Malcolm would convert to the Nation of Islam, he was already prepared by his upbringing to adopt many of the views that the Nation of Islam has. He was born Malcolm Little. By joining the Nation of Islam, his name was changed to Malcolm X, which is to recognize that the surnames have something to do with the slaveholding name imposition. His father, Malcolm's father, died when Malcolm was 6. It was ruled a streetcar accident, but there is reason to believe that, in fact, he was killed by the racist group, the Black Legion. His mother went insane, it seems, when Malcolm was 12, so he grew up in foster homes, eventually ending up with a half-sister, I believe, in Boston, and I believe in Roxbury. He fell into a life of crime and was sent to prison in Massachusetts in 1946, where he served until 1952. He went from Charlestown to Concord to Norfolk, back to Charlestown. In prison, he converted to NOI, the Nation of Islam, which was a small, very strange American religion, as we have many of these homegrown varieties. It's not Orthodox Islam. It teaches a story where white people are invented by a black doctor. It was a horrible mistake, right, that white people exist. So anyway, a lot of odd ideas have nothing to do with Islam, but that they did teach a very strong moral code, and that was something Malcolm needed to get a life that was more integrated. He came out, his several family members had already become members of NOI, so that was part of the background here. He preached for the nation black empowerment and black separatism. So it's a different paradigm than what we'll see with Martin Luther King. A notion that the way to secure black flourishing is to separate and to be able to defend oneself, to defend one's community. It's patriarchal, so to defend one's women and so on. That was the Nation of Islam view. Malcolm was able to preach it with such rhetorical vigor and with such convincing power that a group that was several hundred members large became tens of thousands of members, a major player in black political consciousness. This partly had to do with an incident we would be sensitized to. A Nation of Islam member, Hinton Johnson, had come upon, he and a friend I think, had come upon another black man who was being beaten savagely by policemen, and they had intervened. The policeman beat him so badly he was sent to the hospital. Malcolm's ability to silently gather a crowd that was very well disciplined, but was clearly there to say they're not going to let the police keep Hinton Johnson from receiving the medical care he needed. So this was an early show of what the Nation of Islam could do, and it was because Malcolm X had such a hold over people. So this is one view of how it is the African American community can come to some form of security in a nation where it's been very difficult to live a black life securely. We have this history, right? We have this grave history of slavery that was so much part of what the Founding Fathers had to deal with in getting the constitutional solutions that it did. When Abraham Lincoln vindicated the principle that America is founded on, that every human being is created equal, and he had to vindicate that through a war, through a horrible, horrible war. Unfortunately, he, of course, with his assassination, wasn't able to see that vision through. Even though there were political rights secured with the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments. But the period of Reconstruction, which was supposed to realize these political ideals and give them some kind of social basis in the South, that, of course, miscarried. And what we had was the regime of American apartheid, the Jim Crow system of segregation. It was because of Martin Luther King's leadership, above all, that the system of Jim Crow was dismantled. There were a lot of other players, and Malcolm X is really part of the story too. Because he was so fiery, he was a Black America's prosecuting attorney, right? He could thunder at white callousness and devilry and all of that. Well, that made Martin Luther King seem much more moderate, even though King also had, well, he was going to shake up the whole social order, but it made King look moderate. On the other hand, King was making a case for something that Malcolm came to recognize was valuable, and that is to give African Americans a way to have a voice, a way of a space in which to determine their lives. That's what Martin Luther King was trying to secure. So how do we convert things that are on the books legally into social substance? Well, it's a long and hard history, right? We have the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which had the Supreme Court recognizing that segregation, at least in schools, was not equal, it was unequal. But that was a dead letter for almost a decade, basically. The dismantling of Jim Crow still didn't happen with that decision. You have the Montgomery bus boycott, and this is where Martin Luther King really came into political prominence. He had assumed a Baptist, the head of he became minister of a Baptist church in Montgomery, and he was essential in getting that bus boycott, seeing it through. And I guess I'll do a little bit of the background here. Martin Luther King comes from the Black elite, so this is a very different background from Malcolm X's, who grew up without any social advantages. Martin Luther King did have them. He was born Michael Luther King. His father changed their names when he was moved by a visit to Germany, and moved presumably by the witness of the first reformer. So they belong to the upper strata of Atlanta's Black community. Martin came to understand that he had to also deal with economic injustices, this economic stratification, as his life went on. So I think part of Malcolm had that, I think, more in his blood just because of the experience that he grew up with. Martin Luther King had to come to some of that. After the Montgomery bus boycott, he helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Council, of which he was the first president, and that was a way of trying to harness that activist energy and realize a more profound change than merely integrating the public transportation system. Other important dates in the dismantling of Jim Crow: 1957, you have the Little Rock crisis, in which you have African American students trying to attend Little Rock Central High. The governor, Overall Faubus, at the time had called out the National Guard to keep them out, and it eventually, President Eisenhower sent in the military to make sure that these kids could get to school. So that was a very dramatic chapter in the struggle. And then, of course, you have the great March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, 1963, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. That represents, though, the coordination of a lot of civil rights groups, the Big Six, which includes the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Those two groups in particular were very important in those years in between Little Rock and the March, in organizing sit-ins and freedom rides and trying to actually dismantle the segregationist policies of the South. King was involved. It was in the middle of all that too. Eventually, this resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which officially dismantled Jim Crow. And then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was essential in trying to actually secure practical enfranchisement of African Americans. Now, we still have a lot to look forward to, but as far as the next chapter of achieving equality for for African Americans. And we need to keep in mind the ideals that Martin Luther King has here. The beloved community, which obviously comes from a Johannine sense of Christian solidarity, that economic and social justice are necessary for us to live a life that is the way we were meant to be, the way we were created to be, which is to love one another. And this is King's way of taking he was a Baptist preacher. He did come from the liberal Protestant kind of rationalist milieu, which we've studied a lot of in the Great Conversation, but he did put that to such great social and political use. One cannot take away the title, obviously, of Christian. The civil rights movement depended on the Black Christian church for its efficacy. Without Black Christianity, it just would not have had any effect. King's own philosophy of non-violent resistance comes from a kind of synthesis of satyagraha, the truth force that Gandhi had developed in his resistance to British colonial rule in India, and then Thoreau's notion of civil disobedience. So this is King is adding to the tradition of American political thought and action with this nonviolent resistance that he came up with. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King came to see that their desire to see Black empowerment was aligned with anti-colonial emancipation movements throughout the world. And at the time, this was the Cold War. These were the non-aligned country, what we came to call the Third World, right? And that's kind of a dream that's derailed. That this notion of a multiracial coalition that would see those who've been on the underside of history rise up again. That's been derailed for various reasons, partly because the earlier Black activists, right after the Cold War, it all became part of whether one is communist or not, and that's still an issue when we talk about Black Lives Matter, for instance, as a group. If we want to build a multiracial coalition that realizes the beloved community, perhaps we should talk more deeply about the things that we've been talking about in the Great Conversation. It's very important to deal seriously with these ideas. Towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King was organizing a Poor People's Campaign, another march on Washington, but that's when he was assassinated in 1968. And it's probably telling that at this point, when economic justice was becoming more and more the insistence of King, he was becoming even more dangerous. So we tie this up by thinking about where we are right now in terms of social justice and the African American community. I recommend the excellent and important work by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, because this story does go on, even though King and his victory and the victory of all the other civil rights activists really cannot be gainsaid. To vindicate what was won in the Civil War, to dismantle Jim Crow, that has happened, but there is now a question of the application of state force to Black bodies, the mass incarceration, and of course the question of police brutality. So we still have a very urgent need to look at Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and see how it is that we can live out our responsibility for racial justice in America today.